Imagine a global powerhouse with the world's second largest economy, nuclear weapons, and a military that rivals any nation on Earth, completely loses control over a country smaller than California. This isn't fiction. This is exactly what happened between China and the Philippines, and the details behind it will shock you. What you're about to discover goes far beyond simple politics. We're talking about fishermen being attacked with water cannons, artificial islands appearing overnight, and a democracy that stood up to authoritarianism in ways that surprised the entire world. By the end of this video, you'll understand how one miscalculation changed the balance of power in Southeast Asia forever. But first, let me paint you a picture of how this relationship began, because it started with handshakes, smiles, and billions of dollars in promises. In the early 2000s, China approached the Philippines like a wealthy neighbor offering to help renovate your house. They came with briefcases full of loan agreements, blueprints for highways, railways, and ports that would transform the Philippine economy. President after president shook hands with Chinese officials, signing deals worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The Chinese pitch was irresistible. Why struggle with limited resources when your powerful neighbor could fast-track your development? Modern infrastructure, job creation, and economic growth, all packaged in what Beijing called win-win cooperation. For years, it seemed like the Philippines had struck gold. Before we dive deeper into this geopolitical chess match, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Trust me, what comes next will completely change how you see international relations. But here's where the fairy tale begins to crack. Those promised highways? Many remained incomplete years after groundbreaking ceremonies. The loan agreements came with fine print that would make a lawyer's head spin. Chinese companies were required for construction. Chinese workers were imported for jobs. And the terms were structured in ways that favored Beijing's interests over Manila's needs. Filipino economists started raising red flags. These weren't partnerships. They were debt traps disguised as friendship. But the real betrayal was yet to come, and it would happen in the waters that Filipino fishermen had called home for centuries. The South China Sea covers over 1.4 million square miles of ocean, rich with fish, oil, and natural gas. For generations, Filipino fishermen sailed these waters freely, following routes their grandfathers had taught them. But in 2012, everything changed when Chinese ships surrounded Scarborough Shoal, a fishing ground just 120 miles from the Philippine coast. What happened next reads like a thriller novel, except every detail is documented fact. Chinese Coast Guard vessels, massive ships that dwarfed local fishing boats, began patrolling areas that had been Filipino fishing grounds for decades. They didn't just patrol, they actively blocked Filipino fishermen from accessing their traditional fishing spots. Water cannons were deployed against small wooden boats, creating scenes that would make international headlines. The message was clear. China was claiming these waters as their own, regardless of international law or historical usage. But this was just the beginning of Beijing's master plan. Satellite images reveal the impossible. Barren coral reefs transformed into military fortresses within months. Massive dredging ships, working around the clock, pumped sand and rock from the seafloor to create artificial islands where none existed before. Fiery Cross Reef became a 680-acre military base with runways for fighter jets. Subi Reef sprouted radar installations and missile systems. Mischief Reef, historically a fishing ground, now housed 3,000-meter airstrips capable of launching bombers. 7 reefs became 7 military bases. China militarized international waters while the world watched helplessly. Filipino officials watched in horror as their territorial waters were transformed into Chinese military zones. International law meant nothing when faced with this kind of raw power projection. The Philippines filed complaints with international courts, but China simply ignored the rulings. The breaking point came with incidents that would define the relationship forever. Filipino supply ships, trying to reach their own military outpost at Second Thomas Shoal, were intercepted by Chinese vessels. Water cannons again, but this time directed at official government vessels, not just fishing boats. In one particularly dramatic incident, Chinese ships blocked a Philippine resupply mission to their marine stationed on a grounded warship, the BRP Sierra Madre. This ship, deliberately grounded in 1999 to assert Philippine claims, had become a symbol of national sovereignty. The Chinese blockade was seen as an act of aggression against the Philippine military itself. Videos of these confrontations spread across Filipino social media like wildfire. Citizens watched their countrymen being humiliated in their own territorial waters. The public reaction was swift and powerful. Street protests erupted in Manila and other major cities. University students organized demonstrations demanding stronger government action. Social media exploded with hashtags defending Filipino sovereignty. The sentiment was unanimous. China had crossed a line. This wasn't just about fishing rights anymore. This was about national dignity, and Filipinos were not willing to compromise on that front. Political leaders, who had previously maintained diplomatic language about the complexity of territorial disputes, suddenly found themselves under immense public pressure to take a stand. The Filipino people had spoken, and their message was crystal clear. No amount of economic benefit was worth sacrificing national sovereignty. The government's response marked a turning point that Beijing clearly hadn't anticipated. Instead of backing down or seeking compromise, the Philippines doubled down on its international legal challenges. They didn't just file complaints. They built a comprehensive legal case that would ultimately result in a landmark ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. The 2016 ruling was devastating for China's position. The court declared China's 9-line claim, which encompassed nearly the entire South China Sea, to have no legal basis. The ruling supported the Philippines' position on virtually every major point of contention. China's reaction to this legal defeat revealed everything about their true intentions. They simply rejected the ruling, calling it a piece of waste paper. This blatant disregard for international law shocked even neutral observers and confirmed what many had suspected. China respected only power, not legal principles. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Instead of intimidating the Philippines into submission, China's aggressive tactics achieved the exact opposite result. The Philippines began reaching out to old allies and forming new partnerships with renewed urgency. The United States, which had maintained a complex relationship with its former colony, suddenly found the Philippines eager for closer military cooperation. Joint military exercises expanded in scope and frequency. American military advisors returned to Philippine bases. Intelligence sharing agreements were signed. The message to Beijing was unmistakable. The Philippines was no longer standing alone. Japan, still harboring its own territorial disputes with China, became an eager partner in supporting Philippine maritime security. Australia offered advanced surveillance technology and naval cooperation. Even India, thousands of miles away, began coordinating with Manila on maritime security issues. China's aggressive behavior had inadvertently created exactly what Beijing feared most: a coalition of democratic nations working together to contain Chinese expansion. You're witnessing one of the most dramatic geopolitical reversals of the 21st century. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into international intrigue, make sure you're subscribed, because we regularly uncover stories that reveal how the world really works behind the scenes. The economic dimension of this relationship shift proved equally significant. While China remained a major trading partner, the trust essential for deeper economic integration had evaporated. Filipino leaders began questioning every Chinese investment proposal, scrutinizing the terms for hidden conditions that might compromise national independence. New infrastructure projects were diversified among multiple international partners. Japanese companies found themselves preferred for railway projects. American firms gained access to telecommunications contracts. European investors were welcomed for port development projects that had previously been earmarked for Chinese companies. The Philippines wasn't cutting ties with China economically, but they were ensuring that no single foreign power could gain excessive leverage through economic dependence. This strategy proved remarkably effective at maintaining Filipino autonomy while still benefiting from international investment. Meanwhile, China found itself increasingly isolated in regional forums. ASEAN meetings, once carefully managed to avoid directly confronting Beijing, began featuring more open criticism of Chinese actions. The Philippines, backed by other concerned nations, pushed for stronger collective responses to maritime aggression. The cultural and ideological dimensions of this conflict proved just as important as the political and economic aspects. The Philippines, despite its complex history, had developed into a vibrant democracy with free press, competitive elections, and active civil society organizations. This democratic culture stood in stark contrast to China's authoritarian system. As Chinese influence grew more heavy-handed, it clashed not just with Philippine interests, but with Filipino values. The idea that a foreign power could dictate terms to their democratically elected government was fundamentally unacceptable to most Filipinos. Religious leaders, student organizations, business groups, and labor unions found themselves united in opposition to Chinese overreach. This wasn't a partisan political issue, it was a national consensus that transcended traditional political divisions. The Catholic Church, deeply influential in Philippine society, began speaking out about social justice issues related to territorial integrity. University professors organized academic conferences on sovereignty and international law. Even Filipino celebrities used their platforms to express support for fishermen's rights. This grassroots opposition created a political environment where any leader seen as too accommodating to China would face serious electoral consequences. Chinese influence operations, which had proven effective in other countries, found themselves fighting against deep cultural currents that valued independence and democratic governance. By 2023, the transformation was complete. The Philippines had evolved from a potential Chinese client state into one of Beijing's most determined opponents in Southeast Asia. Military cooperation with the United States reached levels not seen since the Cold War. Economic partnerships with Japan, Australia, and other democratic nations expanded rapidly. Most importantly, the Filipino people had developed what political scientists call strategic autonomy consciousness. They understood that their small nation could maintain independence by skillfully balancing relationships with multiple great powers rather than becoming dependent on any single one. The final irony in this story is that China's attempts to use its superior power to intimidate the Philippines ultimately strengthened Philippine sovereignty. Every aggressive action by Chinese forces generated more domestic support for resistance. Every economic pressure tactic pushed Filipino leaders to diversify their partnerships. Beijing's strategy backfired so completely that it achieved the opposite of its intended goals. Instead of gaining a compliant neighbor, China found itself facing a determined adversary backed by a powerful coalition of democratic allies. The lessons from this confrontation extend far beyond Southeast Asia. Small nations around the world watched as the Philippines demonstrated that determined resistance, combined with smart alliance building and adherence to international law, could successfully counter great power intimidation. China's loss of the Philippines represents more than a bilateral relationship gone wrong. It symbolizes the limits of coercive diplomacy in an interconnected world where public opinion, international law, and democratic values still matter. The story continues to evolve, with new incidents and developments regularly making headlines. But the fundamental shift is irreversible. China gambled that it could use its economic and military power to transform the Philippines into a subordinate ally, and it lost that bet decisively. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who appreciates in-depth analysis of the forces shaping our world. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the stories that matter. The Philippines today stands as proof that national sovereignty isn't just about military strength or economic power. It's about the determination of a people to control their own destiny, backed by smart diplomacy and principled alliances. China may have gained artificial islands in the South China Sea, but it lost something far more valuable: the trust and cooperation of a strategic neighbor. In international relations, trust once lost is almost impossible to regain, and China's aggressive tactics have poisoned the well for generations to come. As we watch this story continue to unfold, one thing remains crystal clear. The Philippines chose freedom over dependence, sovereignty over submission, and democratic values over authoritarian pressure. In making that choice, they didn't just defend their own interests, they sent a message to the entire world about the power of principled resistance. The superpower lost, and the small nation won, not through military might, but through the strength of democratic conviction and the courage to stand up for what's right. That's a lesson worth remembering in an age where authoritarianism seems to be on a rise everywhere. China officially lost the Philippines forever, not in a single moment, but through a series of miscalculations that revealed the true limits of coercive power in the modern world.